Just want to say good morning. My name is Taylor McKinney. I am a project specialist for the New York State Tug Hill Commission. I'm joined today by my colleagues, fellow project specialist Jillian Lee, who is in the background there, and our executive director, Katie Malinowski. For those of you who may not know, the Tug Hill region covers 2,100 square miles of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. We're a small non-regulatory state agency that aids towns and villages on Tug Hill in the areas of land use planning, local governance, community and economic development, natural resource planning, and more. Recently, several communities have reached out to the Commission regarding general advice and technical assistance on federal lead and copper rule revisions regarding public water systems. For these changes, every PWS that is a federally defined community water system or a non-transient, non-community water system must develop an initial service line material inventory, also known as a lead service line inventory, by October 15th of this year. To help us meet this need, New York State Rural Water Association has graciously agreed to partner with us to lend their expertise. New York Rural Water Association, Inc., or NYRWA, is the largest membership organization representing small water and wastewater systems in the state, with system members including villages, towns, municipal water and sewer districts, county authorities, state and federal institutions and facilities, schools and colleges, investor-owned water utilities, homeowner associations, and privately owned systems like mobile home parks. NYRWA is run by and for rural systems, and they assist communities and systems in complying with the complex regulations pertaining to public health and the environment. NYRWA staff provide hands-on technical assistance at no cost to members on a wide variety of topics, working one-on-one with system personnel and making thousands of on-site visits to communities and systems annually. So today we are really fortunate to have Jamie Herman, CEO of NYRWA, who will be speaking shortly, and Mark Roberts, who does technical assistance for NYRWA, to lend us their expertise on these topics. It's our hope that with this presentation, you will, one, have help with answering any lingering questions regarding your LSLI, and two, to connect you with the exact technical experts, personnel who can provide that one-on-one assistance that your community or water system may need if you need help finishing that initial inventory. And for our folks on Zoom, before I hand things off to Jamie and Mark, I do want to make note of a few housekeeping items. For this webinar, attendees are automatically muted and your video feed is turned off to conserve bandwidth. If there are any questions, please type them into the chat box and they will be answered at the end of the question. This whole thing will be recorded and later uploaded to the YouTube page for the Tug Hill Commission. And those recordings and links will be sent to your email for anyone who's registered. Thank you.
Good morning. Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Tug Hill Commission and Taylor especially for holding this. This information is very important. We all know that this reg has been out for several years now, and now we're getting down to crunch time. So we're hopeful to get out some more information. We appreciate the Tug Hill Commission doing this to get information out to as many people as possible. So just a couple of things quickly. First off, the presentation was put together by the State Health Department. And so not all of the slides or some of the slides may pertain to information they had, but it cannot be altered. So this is what we're going to present. And I would just like to touch on something Taylor mentioned. One of the most common first questions we get from people is, why did the state do this? The state did not do this. This is a federal regulation. This is every state in the country having to do this, not just New York. And we see a lot of systems that they have that input from the beginning. And before we really get into this, I would say, if you're having questions, if you're having issues with anything, please do not hesitate to reach out to the New York Rural Water Association for one of our staff to help, or your local health department, your local county office or your state district office. They are a great resource. They are there to help. And ultimately, they're going to have a lot of say in how your inventory is viewed and received. So please do that as much as possible. Okay. Advance, please. One. Okay, you can just go ahead from there. So for those online, if you have any questions, just get in the chat and you can go ahead and type those in, and we have people that'll pass those questions along. Anybody here, please feel free to fire away questions at will as you may want. Go ahead. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is definition of a lead service line and what our inventory is all about. So any portion of the pipe that is made of lead, which connects the water main to the building or to the property, whatever, that is considered a lead service line. So any portion, with one exception. Anybody know what that is here? Gooseneck, right. So if you have a lead gooseneck or a pigtail or a connector, whatever you call that, as far as the inventory goes, that does not make the service line a lead line. But if you add lead from the water main to the curb box, let's say, that makes it a lead line. If you have lead from the curb box to the house, that makes it a lead line. Give me just a second, will you, Taylor? I'm gonna get my clicker. Gotta have a clicker. I don't have a clicker. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Slight technical issue, no big deal. All right, so what is a galvanized service line requiring replacement? A galvanized service line requiring replacement means a galvanized service line that was or currently is downstream of a lead service line or a service line of unknown material. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this because there's a lot of confusion with the systems I have provided assistance to. What that basically means is, let's say there's lead from the curb or from the main to the curb stop and galvanized from the curb stop to the house. That means there's lead before the galvanized. So the galvanized is a galvanized service line requiring a replacement. Let's say that the water main was installed in the 1940s and you do your research or excavations and you find that from the main to the curb box is copper and it's galvanized from the curb box to the house. You are required to prove that that line from the main to the curb box was never lead. That's going to be really tough if you don't have records that indicate that was copper all along. Does everybody follow that? Depending on the age of the water main. If the water main was put in 1920 and it's copper now, is there a good chance it had lead at one time? Yeah. So that would make the galvanized service line requiring replacement. Okay. And it says here, if a water system can't demonstrate that the galvanized line was never downstream of a lead service line, it must presume there was an upstream lead service line. So that means if you don't have proof, records, anything like that, then that's your proof. Okay, then you have to require, or you have to list that as a galvanized service line requiring replacement. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, what is a non-lead service line? It's just basically a service line that's not lead, it's not galvanized service line requiring a replacement, and that's done through either evidence-based method or technique. So I was just working with a system that they built a huge part of their water district in 1963. And we were able to, looking through records, we found where in 1963, they established a spec that all services are copper, okay? And then we found engineering plans and drawings and as-builts for every street. They had a case though where, so let's take any street, right? And the street in this town had 10 houses on it. 8 of them were built after 1963. So there were only 2 houses on that street when they installed this water main and the services, okay? So what are they gonna do? They're going to use the records from the main to the curb box, right? And then they're going to investigate a portion of the newer homes that were built after 1963, just to make sure they followed the copper spec, which in their case they did. But don't they really have to get into those older houses to make sure that the, if they had a well or whatever, that line wasn't used when they put the service from the curb box to the house? Does that make sense to everybody? Those older houses are really what you're gonna have to look for. If the house was built after construction and you had a spec, that should be in there. Another thing to consider while you're doing all this, and I told them, call the code office. Get a hold of the code officer. If these houses were built in 1970, let's say, after the installation of their water system, odds are there's a building permit and the service line material is somewhere in that permit, okay? What was used from the curb box to the home, okay? So what is a lead status unknown service? We all kind of know that, but the definition of it is where a material is not known to be lead, galvanized, requiring replacement, or non-lead. Let's be honest, unknown is something we can't identify and we haven't excavated, so we know what it is, right? How many of you have unknowns in your system? Nobody's willing to share that. Okay. That's, we're all gonna, not everybody. I would bet the majority of systems are gonna have some unknowns, okay? And better to have an unknown, I hate to use the word falsify, but to speculate what something is, right? The whole idea of this is to build an inventory that is factual, okay, that we can work from, all right? So sometimes we are gonna have unknown services, okay? What is the so-called lead ban? For this presentation, that means the EPA amendment in 1986, which banned using lead pipes delivering drinking water. So after that, so where does that come into for operators completing their lead service line inventory? If you have a street or a section of your distribution system where the water mains and services were added after June of 1986, that means that they are not lead, okay? Hopefully, if you have a section that was done after June of 1986, you have records of that as well to depict what was. But that is what we're talking about here. When people, I hear a lot of people in my travels mention the lead ban or 1986 Safe Drinking Water Act amendment. This is what they're referencing. That is your proof that it is not lead, okay? So if I had a street and I didn't have a spec and I don't have drawings, and let's say it was put in 1988, okay? And we installed services from the water main to the curb box. My advice, and you have no records of what they used. First of all, the 1986 Safe Drinking Water Act says that it's non-lead. So there's a case where I think you could make the case to excavate a portion of those, and generally over 20% of the whole houses per street in that area, okay? And find out if they're copper, plastic, or what they might be, okay? I'm probably going to get crucified for that statement of 20%, but that is for a new construction. I want to be clear about this. Let's say the street out in front of here, out in front of this building, was replaced in 1990, and for whatever reason, we don't have any records, okay? And we know it was the water main and the services from the main to the curb box. Now what I'm saying is, how many homes or how many service connections are there on this street? Let's do at least 20% of them excavation. They should all be the same material. And then you're gonna use that information for the rest of them, okay? And thankfully, we have some local health people here who can keep me on the rails here when I bring up something that makes them want to cringe a little bit, okay? What is a gooseneck, pigtail, or connector? Most of us as operators have seen these over the years. How many of you have seen these in your system? Or don't raise your hand to that. How many of you have seen these in somebody else's system? Right? Okay. All right, good. Got everybody listening. So all it is a short section of lead pipe with connectors, and it went from the water main to whatever the service line material was, whether it was lead, copper, galvanized, whatever it was. It was just meant to make that connection. And to be honest, old timers always told me when I started, it was meant to give you a little leeway for ground settling. And if you ever hooked a service line with a backhoe or an excavator, it gave you a little bit of leeway there so that you didn't tear everything out. For the purposes of this presentation, I think it's key to note that if you have a lead gooseneck and let's say copper or plastic the rest of the way from the main to the curb or to the home, the service line is not listed as a lead service line, okay? If the only part of lead is the lead gooseneck, the service line is considered non-lead, all right? How many of you have started your inventory and have worked with the state template? Anybody here? So we got a couple. You will note while you're filling those out, and I'll touch on this a couple of times today, there are blue boxes and gray boxes. The blue boxes are required. The gray boxes are recommended. And one of the questions that you will see is, does it have a lead gooseneck, pigtail? You may or may not know that, right? So that could be unknown. It could be any one of a number of responses to that. But I just want to stress, if you did know 100% you had a lead gooseneck, and then let's say it was copper from the gooseneck to the curb box and copper from the curb box to the house, that will self-list it as a non-lead service line, okay? Everybody good with that? Because we get a lot of calls, and when you're working in that inventory, the spreadsheet will list, it will self-identify based on what you put in, what the service line material is. You do not add that. So we collectively get calls a lot from operators who say, well, I put in a lead gooseneck, but it says it's a non-lead service line, and I'm trying to change that. Well, you don't change that. When you put the data in, that box will fill itself, and you just leave it whatever it is, okay? LCRR, lead and copper rule revision, and LCRI, lead and copper rule improvement. We're just going to touch on this. So LCRR, the lead and copper rule revisions, that is what put the lead service line inventory into play regulatory wise, okay? So it included the lead service line inventory and these other components that are what's next. So I get a lot of operators asking me what's next. And I tell them, and I think the state health department would echo this, let's worry about the inventory right now. Let's not get ahead of ourselves and worry about things that are coming down the road. Let's just worry about the inventory, okay? So LCRI will be, or I'm sorry, LCRR, lead and copper rule revisions, will be replaced with the lead and copper rule improvements, which will cover all of these items in the slide and probably a few more, okay? But again, this is just a brief segment. Let's worry about the inventory for right now. We have what? We have 7 months, not even 7 months. So October 16th of 2024, you're all required to submit your completed inventory to your local health department, okay? So let's worry about that right now. I'm sure there'll be a lot more training from the state, from EPA on LCRI and any other changes in the coming year or years, okay? Yes.
It's important to point out that the LCRI is under public comment.
Yes, that's a good point. So the comment came that LCRI, lead and copper rule improvements, is under its, EPA has put it out for public comments now. So it is a rule in the process to being adopted. And currently it's receiving public comments, and those comments come from the public. They come from associations like National Rural Water Association, American Water Works Association, all kinds of different water related groups such as that. Okay, so those are some of the existing items in LCRI. And that's such a great point because it's not approved right now. So it would be pure speculation to say what's next until it's approved. Okay. All right, so this just touches on some of the LCRI. Again, I don't really want to get into this a whole lot. Let's worry about that when the day comes. All right. There are some find and fix or find and replace items. That's all stuff I think most of us as operators have done. How many of you, whether it's in writing or not, already have a policy wherever you work that if you run into a galvanized or a lead line, it's coming out, right? So, I mean, I think some of these provisions are things that operators are already doing. So we'll deal with these when the time comes. Let's focus today and our efforts right now on the inventory itself. All right. So what systems need to prepare a service line inventory? Taylor touched on this at the beginning. So this is a federal regulation, and it is every non-transient, non-community system. So non-transient, non-community systems are often identified as schools, office complexes. They are basically places where the same people go to work there 4 hours a day, 4 more days a week, 26 or more weeks out of the year, okay? And then there's also the community water systems. So that is municipalities, mobile home parks, those type of facilities, okay? So systems with no lead service lines, galvanized service lines requiring replacement, or unknown service lines. So I received a call not too long ago from a system that was completely redone in 2002, all new mains, all new services, all the way into the house. And they said, do I have to do this inventory because we don't have any lead? Yes, you do. You're going to have to do an initial inventory. And then I don't want to speak on behalf of the state, but I think the feeling is that there forward, once it's completed, there'll be some kind of annual or triannual certification form that you will fill out, and you know your inventory is basically done then. Do any of you fit into that category? Darn it, I'll tell you. Don't you wish you did? Wishful thinking, right? Okay. Systems eligible for a 9-year monitoring cycle under lead and copper rule. Do they have to do it? Yes, they have to do it as well. Mobile home parks, yes. Non-transient, non-community businesses, yes. Comment? No? Okay. So what needs to be included in the inventory? So we have our depiction here of the water main and the service to the home or building or whatever it might be. So first of all, we start with this connector, and let's say it is a gooseneck. It's recommended. That is one of the gray boxes. That is not required on the inventory, but it's recommended, okay? Now that may very well, and again, I don't want to work ahead. As a longtime operator, I would bet somewhere down the road, we are going to have to identify lead goosenecks. So if you have the records, you might as well do it now, okay? But as of the inventory we're doing right now, this is a recommended box, not a required box, okay? And then what we're gonna do is the public side is what it's generally called, or the system-owned service. And we're gonna go right here from the water main to the curb box. And then for the customer-owned service, we're gonna go from the curb box to the house. How are we gonna figure this out? You all tell me, how are you gonna figure out what's in the ground? Excavate both sides of the curb box? Excuse me, whether it be an excavator or back truck is nice for this. It doesn't make a big mess. And then we can identify it that way. How about getting into the customer's home or the business or whatever? Okay. Has anybody here tried to have the customers fill out a little form and take pictures and send them to you? How did that go? Not very well. So I have seen one township, but they started 2 years ago, and they started by doing public education. Their board would have public meetings or hearings, and they got the public involved, and they actually got over 50% of their services. They actually received, they sent them a little write-up, date, address, all that, and they received pictures. So that was fantastic. I would say in my travels, I'm seeing an average of about 5 to 10% response from the public. Would you say that's, oh, so that's not that bad. Yeah. So some of these municipalities that are frustrated over 5 or 10%, I just try to see the bright side of that. That's 5 or 10% of them that you don't have to get into, right? I mean, so that does save you some time and effort. Getting back to the slide, what if a service line is to a vacant building? Do we need to include that? Yes. Okay. What if it's a non-potable service line? Yes. So I was up in, no, I don't want to mention any place. I was in an area that's highly agricultural, and they have a lot of seasonal water services that are for agricultural purposes, and that falls into that. Do they have to identify those services? Yes.
So barns.
Yep. Yeah, so the specific community I worked with, they actually have more agricultural services than they have full-time services. So, you know, as soon as the weather breaks, they're really busy for several weeks getting everybody set up for the season, you know, with their meter and their service and everything. So that does fall into there. Okay. System-owned service line. Yes, you have to do that. What if the customer owns the entire service line? So there are communities in New York State where the customer owns all the way from the water main to the facility. The water supplier is responsible for the inventory. Okay. Right. So part of this federal regulation is that it doesn't matter who owns what. We are responsible as the water supplier for the inventory to be completed. Right.
I have a question back to your survey about going in the home.
Yeah.
Copper
Yes.
coming in the home.
Yep.
Can you assume copper all the way to the main net?
I would talk to your local health department. So the question was, if we didn't have any other records and an operator went into, they had an appointment to go into somebody's home and they saw copper coming through the wall into the home, can they assume that the entire service is copper, or at least to the curb box? No, in my opinion. Okay. I've been at this 36, this is my 36th year as an operator. And I gotta tell you, or I'm asking you, where is the most common place that a customer service leaks or breaks? Where it goes through the wall. And when they have a contractor come out and the contractor says, hey, the line outside the wall doesn't look that bad, I can just piece some copper through there. And that happens more often than not because they save a bunch of money by doing it. Okay. So honestly, if you want to follow the letter of this rule, you should, if you have no idea what any part of a service is, you should excavate the main at the service connection, both sides of the box, and enter the home.
Just because you get 30% of the survey back inside the home, doesn't really mean you can cross those homes off your list. Still more investigating that should be done.
Well, let me step back. So let me go back to when I mentioned that percentage. And I like that you said 30 because I said 20. And I got a couple of coworkers here that would tell all of you that don't know me, I'm pretty strict blockhead by the rules. So doesn't matter what I'm doing. Let's use my example. That system installed a new water main on every road in their township they started in 1963, it finished, I think, in 1965. Okay. So somebody there was progressively thinking, right, that they wanted to build a water system and thinking that people were going to build houses there, which looking back now they have, right? So my point is, let's say there wasn't even a house on that street before 1963. And they built this and they had a spec for copper for water services. They built this water main and services, and then houses got built since then. I would feel comfortable getting into 30% of the homes. There is some argument to be made for 20%, and there is, I don't want to get into what, but there's some regulatory background for that. And because it was new construction and there was a spec and all the houses are built after the water main, if that makes sense to you, then you could assume they all were copper. Okay? Right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I was more referring to mail out flyers to the homeowner, what's in your basement, you get 30% of those surveys back. You can't really, you know what's in the home, but you don't know the rest of it.
No, right. But you can do that. Okay. So that is helpful, right? The hard part with all these, what I'm mentioning about the line being built in 1963, let's say the line was built in 1963 on this road and we had all those specs, right? And only copper. But let's say more than half the houses on that street were there when the water line got built. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm going to tell you right now, I feel obligated to get into every one of those homes because it is entirely possible that whatever they had service material from their well prior to us installing a water system got hooked up. So we need to identify that part. And at the end of the day, I think we all need to remember the whole purpose of this is to identify lead and galvanized requiring replacement. And ultimately, let's be honest, it's going to be to get rid of it. Okay, so that is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do. Okay, right? So all these things need to be recorded, and we really need to make a good faith effort to get those. I've been to a lot of systems already in the last year that they told me over the phone they didn't have any records. You know, we got nothing to go by and we can't afford. How many of you are in this boat? You can't afford to go dig all that up. Either you don't have the personnel, you don't have the equipment. Absolutely. But I got to tell you, I can't even tell you how many systems, probably at least 75 I've been to in the last year just for this. And I can only think of one that once we got looking, they did not have some records. And when I say some, I would say that probably cover 50% at least of the publicly owned side. Okay. So that is a lot, right? So take everything you can find. I always tell people, talk to your code office. I may or may not, this is recorded, so I can't use my whole spiel here, but I may or may not have redone almost all my house, and I may or may not have never gotten a permit to do any of that work. Okay. But I can tell you right now, it doesn't matter where I've been. If a contractor is installing a water service to a home or a business, they're going to get a permit because they don't want a competitor or somebody else turning them in. They're insured. They've got to do things the right way. So I have been to some villages and towns where maybe the current code officer wasn't even aware of how many records they actually had. I went to one in particular, not too far from here, actually, and their code officer found over 75, had a file that had over 75% of their customer-owned side of the service in permits dating back years. The nice thing about all that, it had date, it had material type, it had size, it had who installed it. Okay, so all the material was there. So I wouldn't discredit that that might be available at your system. If you do go into the homes yourself to do the inspections, are any of you doing that now? Anybody scheduling appointments? I would take a picture. Now, you all are professionals. Mark Roberts from our staff, Steve Freeman from our staff. I know we have worked with a lot of communities and we've kind of passed along some good things we've seen from them where they came up with information sheets, just little, you know, like I said, date, service line material, service line size, address, and then take a picture and go with it. Okay. I do not know this firsthand, but I have heard where a large water supplier in New York State did a bunch of inspections and did not take a picture. And they've since been told by the regulatory agency, you need to have a picture. Okay, so I would take a picture as long as you're there. All right. Okay. Should I include these service lines in my inventory? So let's say we're the village, town, city of whatever, and within our water system, we have a shopping center or a prison. Do we have to identify those services? Absolutely. Okay, absolutely. What if we have business complexes that are on private property or a university or a community college or something? Do we have to identify those services? Absolutely. Okay.
That the same case, say a village is supplying users to a town users, not in a district, just they have no private line connected to the village system. Is the village's responsibility still to identify those?
Pretty much, if you're supplying water. Oh, so the question was, there's a village water supplier who has there's not a legal town district, but they are supplying water to residents in the town, and it's essentially a private line. Yeah. You know, you're going to need to identify those because you are supplying them water. And that's kind of in a nutshell what we're doing here. That may also entice the village to do some legal work to create a legal district, so which would be beneficial too. Okay. And then how about if we're the water supplier and we have apartment complexes or mobile home parks? That's one of the most commonly asked. We have a mobile home park we supplied. Do they have to do their own or do we have to do it? You have to do it as a supplier of water. Okay. How are you going to do a mobile home park? Going to have to check the risers coming up. Probably going to go to, you would know what you have at your connection. If you're the supplier of water, you'd have access to that connection. You could see what's going to the park. And then check the risers and things like that. I do not personally, again, just my experience as an operator, I don't worry about a lot of mobile home parks having a great deal of lead. Potentially some galvanized, especially the risers that come out of the ground under the home, yes. But primarily a lot of them are plastic or some other form of pipe, okay? So, but those are all things you have to include in your inventory if you are the supplier of water. This is going to be a little different gig, right? Because if you go to a shopping center, a prison, a university, a community college, it's not going to be 3/4 inch copper coming through the wall, right? It might be 8-inch ductile. Okay? So that is the service line. Does that make sense? So don't get hung up on that. You know, what is the material coming to the building? And that's what it is, right? All right. What water lines should I report? And this goes right to the mobile home parks, the universities, all that. And then we have this little depiction here. So what they're showing is, you know, the line from the wells. And this would be this would be more for, let's say a business, an office complex that had their own water source, okay? So what they would do is identify the line from the well house, in this case, into the building, all right? And then when we talk about a mobile home park, same thing, from the well house or the connection with the municipal system or public water supply up until the homes and what's going into, you know, what the riser is coming up into the homes, okay? Anybody here have mobile home parks or office complexes they gotta take care of? Campground? In theory, yes. I would definitely, with your campground, talk to your local health department, but yes. Yeah, right. From my perspective, you should, yes. And as Bill mentioned, there's probably plans for the campground, the water being laid out.
Depending how old it is.
Yeah, depending on how old it is. Okay. But that makes it difficult, right? That makes it really difficult because you aren't, I'm assuming you don't have to go in there and do repairs. That's the owner doing that. So that makes that difficult. All right. But these are the requirements. Along Lake Ontario, I've had a number of communities call and say, well, there's 100 seasonal homes that we turn the water onto. Are we required to get all their services? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And we all know, you know, things like that tend to be a hodgepodge, right? But you are required to get that information. What I tell them is, we have until, when is the inventory due to our local health department? October 16th. So now for those people that have those seasonals, you've got to turn on, and I wouldn't turn people on unless you can do the inventory, right? I would tell them, hey, while we're out there to turn your water on, we're going to have access to your premises and conduct an inventory of your service line, okay?
Yeah, somebody that won't let you on the property.
Shut their water off. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Don't shut the water off. You know, that's a tough one. You know, a lot of people are gonna have that. You know, when I managed the system, I swore to God some of them were in witness protection because they wouldn't even let you on their porch, right? So you have to work around that, right? You just got to keep trying to get in. You know, it's a good faith effort. That's how I view this. Is, did you make a good faith effort to get the information? It might come down to that one needs to be excavated, right? And that's what you're gonna go by.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, you know, there's, I don't want to get too far off the beaten path with this with my personal opinions, but, and we'll get to that later, and remind me and I'll touch on it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if you don't, yeah. And that's where there is some discretion in this. When you're dropping these boxes down for how did you identify something? So I've got a service line. Oops, I grabbed the wrong one. I can't move this one. Okay. So I just want to go back to this depiction where we have our whole service line, okay? Kind of lost my train of thought, but let's be honest. As an operator, a longtime operator, is it more likely that the longest length of the customer-owned service line is going to be at the curb stop versus inside the home? What I mean by that is if I excavated both sides of the curb stop and the customer side is galvanized, Don't you think it's more likely that if you're gonna find something newer, copper or plastic, and it wasn't a full service line replacement, it's gonna be in the house, not out here? Okay? So where they won't let you in, maybe you do an excavation and identify it that way, okay? That's what I would do, and I would say nobody on earth is gonna say you didn't make a good faith effort to get factual information at that point, okay? All right. Okay, so here's a couple things, because a lot of people question this lead gooseneck and galvanized service line requiring replacement. So the top left depiction shows a lead connector, so a pigtail or a gooseneck. And then it shows the system-owned service, okay? And then the customer-owned service. So this would be a galvanized service line requiring a replacement because it had lead before the galvanized, okay? The next one on the top, this shows, and if you look, I should say you look down here, currently non-lead but previously lead is this color code. So again, the customer service would be listed as a galvanized service line requiring replacement because we know that we had lead before it at one time. Does that make sense? Okay. And then this color code means that it's currently non-lead, including galvanized, but previously unknown. So, and we have lead in, or I'm sorry, galvanized into the customer home or unknown. So that's a galvanized service line requiring replacement. So basically, I don't like this slide a whole lot because I think it confuses things. What I like to tell people is, if you have lead, or you might have ever had lead upstream of galvanized, then the galvanized is galvanized service line requiring replacement. End of story, period. If you cannot 100% prove that this galvanized never had lead before it, then it's galvanized requiring replacement. Okay?
Just galvanized as lead.
Yeah. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, but I have read articles that said we also have to worry about galvanized absorbing lead if it had lead before it and releasing it, now. So they're definitely concerns. And from an operator standpoint, why don't we want galvanized services? Junk. They're gonna break, they're gonna leak. How many of you have installed a service on your side and had to connect to a customer's galvanized, and while you're tightening that coupling, you're just praying that it doesn't leak or crush through pipe or whatever, okay? Happens every day, right? So those are all things we gotta worry about, all right? Can't move it. Okay. So this is a little cutaway of the template that was developed by the state health department. And I think the template really works well. And they've actually released more templates for any of you, and they are available on the state health department website. I'm sure your local health department could get those for you. They're also available on our website. And what they did now was they have made different templates based on your population served. So when it first came out, I think it was 49,999. It was a huge file. And if you only had 100 services, it was kind of overkill. So now they have one for up to 500 service connections, and then one from 501 to 4,999. So you can pick the one that's right for your system, right size for your system. So what do I need to include? If we look at this, again, the blue boxes, the boxes that are highlighted blue are required. And the ones that are gray are recommended but not required, at least at this time, and that's all we're gonna worry about right now, is the current inventory we have to do. So, current public side service line material, and this is a drop down. I want to touch on this real quick. Do not get hung up on this little down arrow. What you'll actually do to make the drop down work is click in the box below it. Okay? So if you were looking at your inventory, the box below it is not going to say anything. It's going to be blank. You're going to click in that box, and then the drop down of galvanized, copper, plastic, lead, unknown but likely lead, unknown but not likely to be lead. All those are going to drop down, and then you can pick from those. Okay? Same with any of those boxes that have these. So you would actually click in the box to bring the drop down down. All right? So we're going to fill out the customer or the current public side service line material. Was the public service line material previously lead? You know, that's going to be your call. Do you have proof that it never was? When did we stop using lead predominantly? 86. When did we stop putting lead in the ground for a service line material?
After World War II.
I would say at the onset of World War II, because we were using all that for munitions. That does not mean there wasn't some left. Could a water supplier, and I know some of you are probably saying, well, Jamie's talking like he's a regulator, but I'm talking like an operator who's been there. Is it entirely possible that somebody laid a new water main and didn't change any of the services and hooked an existing lead service to the new water main? Absolutely. Okay. So that's why we have to do these inspections. So if your plan doesn't say services were done, that's going to send a red flag up to me. Okay. A lot of times in your plans, as-built, drawings, whatever you call them, if you look through those, you're going to see where the engineer made notes. I would look through all those notes because most recent projects, and when I say recent, probably 1970 on, you're going to see where the engineer put in there what was used for service line material from where to where. 3/4 inch K copper from main to curb box, every single service. Or 3/4 copper from main to service, unless otherwise documented on the map. Okay, where generally they do that if there might have been a couple of larger services, let's say, for bigger facilities. So that covers that, right? I did run into that system that was 1963. I'm digging through there looking for those notes, and I never found them. And then I actually looked at the drawings, and every single service line on every single street was documented. 3/4 copper from main to curb box, 1.5 inch copper from main to building for an existing structure that was there. So yours might be a little different, but that should be on there. Okay. And then what was your method of verification? Did you use records, maps, as-built, drawings, any of that? Did you do a field inspection? Did you go out and take a picture? Did you do an excavation? How did you determine that? Those kind of things, all right? There are other drop downs in there. Predictive modeling. So a lot of the larger water systems in the state, and this had to be done a while ago, they have engineers or consulted with an engineer, and they created a plan for sampling. So what they had to do was sample known lead, known galvanized, known copper, known plastic, all the way from the house to the main. So it might be, just for argument's sake, 10 1-liter samples, and you could tell where they came from. And then they would create, you know, a chart of what a lead service line would read and what a galvanized service line would read. Most of us aren't going to get involved in that kind of work. Okay. And then we have public service line installation date. If you have records, you're going to have that. If you don't, you know, that's That's gonna be an unknown, right? A lot of us are gonna have a lot of unknowns there. And then public service line size, so they categorize these, so like up to 1 inch or 1 inch to 1.5 inches, all that kind of stuff. So you just drop those down. And then we have the customer service line material, same thing, galvanized, plastic, copper, lead, whatever it might be. You can drop those down. And then customer service line material verification, how you identified that. Did you excavate? Did you go in the home? You know, did you use records? How did you do that? Okay. And then at the end, this is what you'll see, the last box before the notes. It will say service line category, and it will self-fill based on what you put in. So you don't change that, you don't do anything with that, okay? It'll self-populate based on what you put in for the public side and the customer side, okay? Does that make sense? A lot of people wanting to change that, and that just self-populates.
Find some other information saying that it's not.
So that's a great question. So the question, yeah. The question was, what if I already inputted a service line, but then I find some data or do an excavation or whatever, and I identify things I didn't know before? This is a living document. This is not October 16th, it's done and I'm gonna file it away. This is always, I don't want to say always, but for as long as we use it, it's going to get updated, right? So if you find material, and before you submit it, if you find it before October 16th, go in there and change it. Once you submit it to your local health, you're still going to have your original copy and you would want to alter that. One thing I have already talked to some operators about is this notes section. I doubt anybody is going to use this greatly because it's already a lot of work, right? But if I made any changes after it was submitted to my local health department, I'm going to date that. Or highlight it somehow. That way it's an easy find for me when I talk to my health department that, all right, this is what I've done since October 16th, 2024, identifying services, okay? So I would definitely encourage people to do that. And the notes can be good for a lot of things, right? So whatever it is. I was working on a water system that had a curb box. Let me ask you this one. They got a curb, you know, the main to the curb box, got a curb box. And then there were 2 houses out there. So they went from the curb box to a T to 2 more curb boxes. And then to the houses. So they basically split the service out on private property. That way, smart for the operator, right? Because now I can shut either house off without shutting them both off at the curb stop, right? Do I have to report all those curb boxes? Yeah, especially if the material changes between them, all right? The water supplier had a spec for copper, right? And they ran copper up until that T, and then they ran plastic from there to the homes. So now we've got to identify those, okay? So that's where it gets tricky. All right. So this makes sense to everybody. This is kind of what the inventory is going to look like for those of you that haven't seen it. Now, I will tell you, so before this, there's going to be an address box, okay? If you can get your accounts to where you can sort them. So how many of you are doing some kind of, you have some kind of electronic system for meter reading? Wow, you guys need a break for a donut. You know? How many people have an electronic, something on a computer for your accounts? If you can, or you can get a clerk to do it or whatever, the best thing I've found is if you can take that and sort it by street, because maybe your accounts don't go by street, right? I might read meters on one side of one street and then be on a different street. If you can sort it by street, and then you can take those addresses and copy and paste them into this, just the address. right? Like 22 School Street, you know, blah, 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 blah. That'll save a lot of typing. And the other thing I've found is if you have a whole street that you have records for, and there's uniformity, let's say they all said copper, right? Instead of using those drop down boxes, I'm just going to hit the first letter. I'm going to tab between boxes, if that makes sense, and I'm going to hit the first letter. So like copper, C for copper, and it's going to populate. And it's a lot quicker than going through those drop downs once you have something, okay? But that, you're going to need to know all the material for those to do that, okay? Any questions on this? All right. What do I need to include in the inventory? This is just going back to what we were talking about. This particular slide is going to be the report menu or the report page that goes to your, I shouldn't say, the whole thing is going to go to your local health. But this is probably, and I'm speaking out of turn here, but all of our local health department employees are just as shorthanded as we are. So I'm betting they're not going to have time to go line by line through your inventory. They're going to look at this report first, at least, I would think. And the first thing they're going to do is probably try to see or make sure that you have the same number of services total. So this says total number of service lines in the distribution system right here. They're going to want this total number to equal however many services you have. Okay, so on your monthly operational report, there should be a total number of services. So I like to stress to operators, if I have 2,400 water services and I only report 1,800, that's going to throw up a red flag, right? Everybody understand that? Okay, so be aware of that. And you might want to check the reports page before you submit it to your local health department. And then what this, and I know it's probably hard to see in here, it's probably easier to see online, but this is going to tell you the total number of identified service lines, the total number of lead service lines, the total number of galvanized service lines requiring replacement, the total number of non-lead service lines, and then this box breaks it down by customer side versus public water system side and all that kind of thing. And then what your identification methods were, how you identified those results, okay? So this is really where the rubber meets the road, and you are going to have to sign this and submit this to your local health department, okay? One last thing about this, when you're getting started, they don't really, and I would ask you to ask your local health department, but they're not asking you to put Town of Lee Water District up here. What they really want is your PWS ID number. And then your contact information, your name, your number, your email, whoever is going to be the point of contact for the health department to reach, okay? Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but this is a federal regulation. So at some point, I believe, and this is just me speaking, not Rural Water, not Tug Hill Commission, not any health department, but in my opinion, at some point, EPA is going to do enforcement in every state by doing audits. They're going to pick some systems at random, and they're going to go out and they're going to say, okay, show me your records for all these services. Okay, how did you identify this? Where are your records? Okay, so I hope that I'm wrong, but they've got a lot of public sentiment between Flint and things that have happened around the country. I think they're going to have to take that step. But again, that's my opinion. So when you're doing this, be honest. If you don't know and you didn't excavate and you didn't get in, what is it? What is the service if you did not really verify it? What are you going to put it down as? Unknown, right? I would not go making big guesstimates on this stuff. Okay? This whole idea is this is an inventory. It's a living, breathing thing. I have had one operator tell me on October 17th, I'm going to delete this file and never think of it again. And I'm like, no, no. This is a living thing. You're always going to be improving on it. And I would go one step farther and say that's going to be one of your hardest jobs, is because once the compliance part of this is done October 16th, and somebody over on the other side of town is installing a new service, you need to get that data, right? People say to me, why would I put all these policies in place? I had a supervisor once tell me, we're going to put it's not a permit, but they're going to have to fill out an application to install a customer side service. And I remember being a younger man and saying, well, that's just stupid, you know. Why are we doing this? Generating more paperwork. You've all heard it, right? Protecting my job. I look back on that and think what a great idea that was. Okay. Because from that date forward, that water system has a record of every service that was installed from the curb box to the house. And they didn't charge for it. It was just, you got to come fill this out. And so those are all done. All right. So things we can do to make this better for the future are definitely in play. All right. Okay, what if customers own the entire service line? They still, and they being EPA and the way the state template is set up, they want us to treat the service line as if it splits, just like part of it's public, part of it's private. But it's publicly or it's privately owned, but we're still splitting it kind of at the curb box, all right? That does not mean you're assuming legal responsibility from the main to the curb box. It's just a way of doing that, okay? That's how we're going to do it for now. You might want to denote in the, there's a case where you could copy and paste on all of them if you wanted, privately owned or whatever, you know, customer owned, so that it's there, okay? All right, acceptable identification methods. Record searches, so curb box cards, maps, drawings, as-built, whatever. One of the coolest things I've seen so far was, and I was explaining this to an operator, and he's like, 8 years ago, we had a meter replacement. And we're like, I was like, really? And they're like, yeah. And I go, you collected this data? No. But the engineering firm that they worked through required the contractor to take a picture of the incoming line at every home. And they had it on a thumb drive. I'm like, oh, how could this be any better? Every address and the entire system listed. And they even went a little farther and they had a little write-up with them of the size, wrote down the material type. Okay. I think that had nothing to do with this. It was entirely because nobody wanted to get sued if the customer's pipes leaked after they installed the meter and all that. But that was a great thing. So don't always think of just the easy, low-hanging fruit. Excavation is going to be another method. You know, backhoe, excavator, vac truck. I think my colleagues from Rural Water would say they've seen more municipalities buy a vac truck in the last year than a lot of them. You know, this was the last thing that threw them over the edge of being able to buy a vac truck, okay? There's a couple of counties where everybody's chipped in and bought a vac truck and hope, you know, maybe if they have access to that. It may come down to applying for some grant money or something and trying to hire a contractor with a vac truck to come in and identify, because there are going to be some of you that you don't have records, and you know, 90% of your system you're not going to be able to identify without excavating, and that's tough. That's really tough. Anybody here fall into that boat? Sorry. I mean, that is a tough. That's a tough, yeah. My advice to you would be to look for grant money, to hire a contractor to come in, because I don't know your system, but I'm just gonna make the assumption that you, even if you had equipment, you don't have the personnel to commit to it daily to do it. I don't know that. Yeah, so you're gonna need a contractor to come in, and that's where our staff, I'm sure Tug Hill Commission, often speak to elected officials and try to educate them on, you know, the importance of doing this properly and thoroughly. And I would say also, I've been places that actually have lead lines from, especially from the main to the curb box, and they're just distraught. And I'm like, well, that's where you need to be working with your engineering firm to, right now, to start a process with your elected officials of applying for funds to replace these, because the monies are out there. And they are out there in huge amounts. It's up to you to go get them, okay? So those are all things. Visual observation, so camera, all that kind of stuff. Public outreach falls into that. That would be where we ask the public to self-identify and take pictures. Funny thing the state always brings up, they had an example of somebody sent in, a homeowner sent in 6 pictures, and none of the 6 pictures were of their service line. It was their cat, their dog, their couch. So that's not really that helpful, okay? So got to get the right one. There are little videos out there. A lot of municipalities now have websites. I encourage them, if they do, to put a little video on there. It's less than a minute long. And it shows a homeowner doing a scratch test, a magnet test, and how to identify what their incoming service line is. Okay, so that is a good resource we've found. All right. Other methods, sequential tap sampling. So that falls into what we were talking about with the engineers and coming up with a plan. That ship has sailed for October 16th. It's too late, because you would have to develop a plan, a study. You would have to submit that plan to the state health department for approval. We don't have enough time to do that. It's kind of for most places. And I hate to even mention this, but it comes up almost everywhere I am, and I'm not knocking anybody. There is a company who is trying to sell a device. And the last time I saw it, they said it was, I did not see it. I taught a class and somebody brought me a flyer where it said it's EPA compliant. So it's a device that basically you send into the service line from inside somebody's home or business. And it basically reads millivolts. Okay. And they are selling this to operators, saying that this is an EPA approved method to identify the service line material type. So what they're saying is certain service lines would read this, certain, you know, lead would read this, galvanized would read this. Personally, again, do I think there's a lot of merit to that technology? And someday, yeah, but it's not approved, at least not as of the last time I officially made a request to see if it was approved was 2 months ago, and it was not approved. So there's a lot of variables that go into any of this, right? The sampling or a piece of equipment like that. What if how many of you are installing a corrosion inhibitor? Right? Is that going to alter those readings? Sure it is. Right? So there's a lot of variables to what all these things do. Okay. So really the best ways to identify are going to be records, number one, visual observation, excavation. Okay. Acceptable records. We've talked about this a lot already. Construction, mapping, service line, meter installation slips. If you have those and you documented the service line material and size, any of that kind of stuff. Engineering plans and specs. Do not forget about codes, right? Local codes, code permits, okay? I have found where they are can be quite extensive. Also, you know, don't give up on your customers, right? If you get 10%, that's 10% you don't have to get. It's not what we hope for. Don't we wish we could send a letter and we would get 75%? Yes. But if you get 10%, that's 10% you don't have to go out and get yourself. So I would grab that, okay? Any other kind of records that you might have. All right, so just keep those. And then when I identify those records, I'm going to put them all in one drawer or one space in case I am ever asked to prove why I said I had records for these, right? Because I've been to some places that had 7 map drawers, and we used one map out of this drawer and one map out of drawer number 6 to identify what we did. I'm going to put all those maps together and keep them somewhere so that, or make copies of them and keep them somewhere so that I know if I ever get called into question, I can show the health department, EPA, whoever, why we made that selection. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So this is kind of what I was talking about, that sampling that we're talking about. So what they're saying is an engineer would calculate how many liters of water are from the faucet out to the water main, and you would collect those. But there's a lot of benchmarking that needs to be done with this, because they're going to have to study, they're going to have to do this for known lead lines, known galvanized, known copper, known plastic, to come up with a benchmark of what the readings will be for those. To be able, because what we're talking about is they want to be able to use this to go to a house where they have no record at all from the main to the house. And just by sampling, say, okay, from the house to the curb box is galvanized, and from the curb box to the main is copper. So you're going to have to create quite a, I think we would all recognize, to do that effectively, you're going to have to show a lot of proof on what your benchmarking is for your samples, okay? So that is kind of what we're talking about there, all right? Do all model results need physical verification? New York State will accept some model results without physical verification on a case-by-case basis. So that's where I went to what I was talking about, that 20, 30%. If it's me, I want to be at 30%. I think you could make the case to a lot of health department people, 20% would be legit. And we can talk about that later, but for most of us, for you guys in the back, I feel terrible for you, the situation you're in. If we can identify the age of homes, right? So if we know a water main was installed in the 50s, and we know all the homes were built, I'm not saying the same year, but you know, they're the same age, roughly, give or take a little bit. That gives us some variability to say, okay, if I checked all the streets or half the houses on one side of the street and they're all galvanized coming in, would it be fair to assume that all of them are? It might be, okay? But if you got 10 houses on a street and 5 were built in 1899 and 2 were built in 1920 and the rest were built after 1970, we can't do the same thing, right? You follow what I'm saying? We can't go to all the houses built in 1970 and see copper coming through the wall and say, okay, all those older houses are copper too, right? So we got to use some data of the age of homes or structures and those kind of things, okay? What that does help with, does anybody here have like a housing development that was built or whatever? I've worked with a lot of communities where a good portion of their total number of services are housing units that were built in very late 80s or early 90s. Does that lend itself to the Safe Drinking Water Act Amendment of 1986? Right. And let's be honest, you should have some engineering plans for work that was done that recently, okay? So those are all kind of things we're going to talk about, or we're going to use for our purposes, okay? So we would have a number of unknown service lines, a number of known service lines on a street, and make that assumption. But Again, we have to get more information, age of homes, age of businesses, age of whatever building a service is feeding. Does that make sense to everybody? Because I feel like I'm kind of branching off. Right? Good? Okay. All right. So our public water system was built after June 1986. If you have the following records, choose service line materials in column E and J from the drop down. So written records showing the entire distribution system was constructed after June of 1986 or the local lead ban. So the entire length of the customer-owned service line was installed after 86. So, you know, you can fill that out as, and that's going to be non-lead. You still need to do it. I want to stress that. You still need to do an inventory. But more than likely, once it's done, you're just going to have to do some kind of annual, triannual, whatever certification that nothing has changed. So you're going to have to go through and say it's copper, it's plastic, or whatever it is, whatever service line material was used. Okay. So does that make sense? Or you're still going to have to do that. Does anybody here fit into that? Anybody here have a brand new system? Brand new by our standards. Okay. No. We actually have one board member who falls into this, and what a lucky devil. Okay. So he's got to still do it, but he's done once it's done. Okay. And this is where we all want to be eventually, right? Not the 86 amendment. The whole goal of this is that someday in the not too distant future, we're all going to have everything identified, good, bad, or indifferent. Doesn't matter if it's lead, galvanized requiring replacement, copper, plastic, but to have them all identified and know what needs to be done to get rid of the lead hazard from service line connections, right? So that's the ultimate goal of all that we're doing, okay? We've already talked about this from the customer self-identification. They need to have a picture, 100%. I don't think anybody is going to accept a customer's, even a written statement saying it's copper. They're going to want a picture, okay? But I would encourage you to have some kind of data that goes with it, date, address. You know, don't over ask your customers, but if they can do some basics with it, that would be helpful. All right. And I think a lot of you are going to have to go out and do a lot of those inspections yourself. One thing I have found is to take, you know, somebody high up at the state told me early on, because my initial thought was, I was saying to operators 3+ years ago, I wouldn't worry about everything you got records for. I would put that off to the side. And I would worry about the old stuff you don't have records for. And her opinion kind of changed mine. She said, you know, I'd rather you take the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, the stuff you know, and get that in there. And then worry about this stuff. Either way you go, I've had a lot of systems now telling me, so they've started it and they know what service, customer services that they can identify. And they come up with a number. And it was interesting for me to hear that perspective, and I pass it along. So what they're doing is, let's say they said we have 200 we got to get. How many working days do we have before we have to turn this in? Is what they did, and they divided that into 200, and that's so what they're doing is they have found that they go to work earlier than the majority of people in their community leave their house for work. How many of you know that in your community? And what they're doing now is scheduling appointments for that time frame between when they get to work and when their customers have to leave. So they might do like 2, 3, 4 a day in that, because they're only going to take 10 minutes a pop. And they go out and do that, and then they go do their other work the rest of the day. And a lot of communities have said that's worked really well for them. So we pass that along. Not to say it's going to work for everybody, but I think we got to try every method we can to get this to work. All right. So these are some pictures that the state uses in their slide. Some of them are obvious what they are, like this one. You know, that's 100% copper, okay? And then we have some that are gonna be questionable of what the service line is. So this one just fries me because any regulator is gonna tell you, I can't tell what that is by the picture, top right. I'm gonna tell you all day long that's copper, because that's a brass copper nut right there. But that's the difference between an operator and a regulator, and I'm not finding fault with the regulator. I am agreeing with them. If I turn that picture in, is that clearly identifiable to anybody what that service line is? Absolutely not. Okay. But that's why the picture is important. Could I go out there and take a picture that looks like that? How many basements you guys been into, right? I mean, there's only so much you can do to clean it up and to get light on the topic so that it looks visible, okay? So that is a difficult thing to do, all right? Okay, potholing, we've already talked about this. So what we're saying, if you're gonna excavate, whether it's a vac truck or a machine, should be excavating at the main, both sides of the curb box, and then getting into the home and identifying. Now, the hard part for all this is, let's say I identify both sides of the curb box and this is galvanized going to the home. And then we have the case that we talked about earlier, got copper coming through the wall. I'm going to list that as galvanized, okay, because there is galvanized there. Because I've had this question from operators. If you put down that it's copper, you're making the assumption it's copper the whole way, which it is not. There is a piece of galvanized in there. So that's how I would identify that line, okay? So where should I start? We've covered this. We're going to start with our records. We're going to do inspections or assessments of facilities. We're going to reach out to engineering firms maybe who might have some records that maybe we've lost. Or I did work in a community that their entire public works building burnt down a few years ago, and all their maps were lost, and they were able to reach out to their engineer who had done a lot of their work, and they had copies and they were able to use all that data. Okay, so whatever you have to do, excavations, I would say, are going to be the last step, right, of what needs to be done. Okay. Any questions on that? And then we're going to try and get our public involved. So you've kind of, part of what I don't like when I do this is I say things along the day that I later regret. So I've told you it's too late for that. It's too late. It's never too late. This is an inventory. It's a living document. Do not give up on the public. But I think it's important that you get buy-in from your local elected officials to have some public meetings. Get it, if you have social media, get it out on there. I think one of the biggest wastes of time is to send a separate letter to your customers. Send it with the bill. Because I'm a firm believer that a separate letter that is not a bill that goes to your public, 75% of them are going in the garbage. Most people aren't even going to take the time to read it, okay? But if it's attached to the bill, they're going to read it, okay? Get them involved. So when I say there's not time for October 16th, do not read that as there's still time to get your public involved and do a lot of this work for you. Because October 16th isn't the end of doing this, okay? This is a living document until it's done. So I would really encourage you to do that, okay? Where do I submit my inventory? We're going to submit that, the initial inventory, to the local health department via email or some kind of cloud storage. I would say contact your local health department and ask them how they want it delivered to them, okay? Because they're the ones that are going to have to handle that data. How do they want it delivered, okay? comply with the public notification requirements. The local health department is going to review the inventory for completeness. Do you have the right number of services? And have you identified as much as possible, accuracy wise? They may request some supporting documents. And then they're going to forward that inventory to the State Department of Health, who is going to enter the inventory into CIDWIS, which is a database that EPA will access for that data. Okay, so it's going to work from your local health department to the state, from state to EPA eventually. Okay, I have no idea on what that time frame looks like from the date you turn it in to the date it goes to, or EPA is going to be aware of that. There's obviously has to be some time for each step of this for people to review data, but we'll see how that all works out. Okay. And the State Department of Health, the New York State Department of Health may reach out to you and require some supporting documentation, or your local health department may do that, whatever. Again, we want to be accurate, but I worry about people that have too many unknowns. And what I say, this rule has been out for how long, Mark? 4 years. I can't tell you how many training sessions New York Rural Water Association has done with the state health department, or had state health department people come in and do. Not even counting American Water or New York Section AWWA, every other local health department's doing their own. I think we did 32 last year. So we covered the whole state best we could. We appreciate Tug Hill Commission doing this today, but the word has been out there. Again, just me talking, but I really worry about systems with 70% unknown. Again, this is not the state talking, it's not rural water talking, it's Jamie as an operator talking. I think that's going to send up a red flag that you waited to the last minute, or so I would do everything you can to get factual information and get it entered in there. I don't want anybody to leave here today though and say, well, Jamie said 70% is going to throw up a red flag, because I have no idea if it is, but I got to believe it is. But it doesn't matter. I would not put non-factual information into this. If you have 90% unknown, that's what it is. I would not put anything in there that I could not justify. Okay? Everybody agree with that? All right. It is. It is. It's not the end, October 16th. You're going to have to keep working at this until it's completed, right? And I think it's fair to say completed means at some point, and I'm sure that'll be a regulation, but at some point, completed is going to mean every service is identified and none of them are lead and none of them are galvanized requiring replacement. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know when that's going to be, but that is the ultimate goal of this inventory. Okay?
Is there going to be a penalty if you do not complete this on October 16th? I mean, what are they?
There are violations for it. This would be a violation just like any other violation, sampling violation, or there are violations. And again, I am not a regulator and I don't want to speak to this too much, but I would bet when it gets to the federal level, at least, there are some financial penalties. But again, I am not a regulator, so I don't feel comfortable speaking about that, but 100% failure to complete this, that does trigger violations just like any other water violation, sampling, treatment technique, or, any kind of deficiency of that nature. Okay.
The other thing you want to point out is that this is all the inventory that drives the funding for replacement.
Yes.
That state assisted funding.
Yes.
All grants and everything.
Yes. And we're gonna touch on that in just a minute, and then I'm gonna end a little early so that we can have some question and answer, but that is such a great point, Bill, that the inventory, and if there was any takeaway that I would tell you at this point today, right now, you all as operators, if you haven't, you need to engage your elected officials. And how many of your boards, how many of you know that your board knows about this regulation and that you're working on? That's good. That's a first step. I would, number one, reach out to them. And if you have a lot of unknowns, I would have them start doing public meetings of some kind to encourage participation from the public in identifying the services, number one. I would also talk to them about engaging most municipal water systems at some level, either have their own large ones or us smaller ones, have an engineer that we generally use or an engineering business. I would encourage them to, why don't we invite our engineer to a meeting and start talking about what Bill's talking about, what's next. We're going to use this inventory to apply for funds for replacements. Okay. And that's a big deal. So, but I'm telling you right now, and I told you early on today, I am a blockhead. I follow the rules, and most people do not live like I do. And I am the first to admit that. But I would want my board on board, so to speak, right now. Because if you wait till after you turn your inventory in, everybody else is going to be in line. And those engineering firms only have so many people and so much time. And odds are your engineering firm's working for a bunch of other people too. Okay, so I would be right now taking these steps. You might not get big participation from the public before October 16th. That's fine. Let's set the groundwork. Maybe over next winter's months, while people are more at home, maybe we get participation because we spent the time now educating them. And that's great. That's a win-win, right? Because everything that goes in October 16th that is unknown is going to need to be identified at some point. Okay? So I would encourage that. And I would bet if you have a great deal, and I'm not picking on anybody, but if you have a great deal of unknowns, it means your system was put in before the advent of real engineering plans, and which means it's fairly old. And you might have more history on that than you think from service line repairs for water leaks, if you wrote that down anywhere, or even your own use. What was that material? I can tell you when I started, almost every service we dug was galvanized, right? And we did a lot of work over the years to replace those lines and our water mains. But if you're having that trouble, odds are you're gonna qualify. If you can do some identification and get your engineer involved, you're gonna qualify for funding, right? The state, as Bill mentioned, has funding. The federal government has put out funding. A lot of you have probably heard on the radio or television about bipartisan infrastructure law monies, bill money, they call it. That's a big chunk of that is for lead service line replacements. Okay. All right. Last thing I want to tell you is this, and then we're going to just stop the presentation and take question and answer, because I find no fault with the local or state health department, but one thing I did find during those trainings we did with them, and it was probably because we were out of time, right? Just like I am now. We didn't really cover this thoroughly. So I want to cover this, and it's no offense, because I think the local and state health department are used to writing letters to systems and stuff like that. We as operators are not letter writers for the most part, okay? So when we get this inventory done, we submit this to our local health department, and then we have one more step. And I want to just stress this. So top left here, when do we got to do this? To notify our customers within 30 days of completion of the lead service line inventory and annually thereafter. What we are required to do, to whom all customers served by a lead service line, a galvanized service line requiring a replacement, or an unknown. We have to mail them a letter or come up with some other method of doing that that's approved by the State Department of Health. So what we're gonna have to do is take every single lead service line we've identified, every galvanized service line we've identified, or galvanized service line requiring replacement, let me stress that. And every unknown, and we're gonna have to send them, and I'm quite certain there's gonna be specific language in those letters. And we're gonna have to send those homeowners or business owners, wherever the service is going to. We're gonna have to send them a letter within 30 days of October 16th. So that leads me to my last thing about involving your local elected officials. Try and get the public to participate and take pictures of their service. Inform them that these letters are going to be coming out to certain people. So you wanna, in my opinion, you wanna educate your public that you are complying with a federal regulation, okay? And part of that regulation is that anybody whose service is identified as lead, galvanized service requiring replacement, or unknown, we don't know what it is, you are going to receive a letter after October 16th. Because while I've said the majority of people chuck an individual letter, it didn't come with on my bill, they throw it in the garbage. What about that, in my mind, that 25% who does open it and they haven't heard anything about this rule, they didn't know you guys were doing this, and I open this letter up and it implies that my service might be lead. Because let's be honest, if you're an unknown, I gotta believe somewhere in that language, it's going to say it could be lead. And you got 2 kids over there that are, 1 and 4 years old. You can't blame the public at that point for wondering what's going on, right? So I would spend a little time right now educating the public that these letters are gonna come out. And I think that'll make it a lot smoother when they do. I think personally, again, I think a well-documented system, a system who really worked hard, I mean, not just with documents, but also did some excavations. I still think in New York State, they're probably gonna have at least 20% unknown lead or galvanized requiring replacement, okay? Anybody here have any reference to say that that's not true? I mean, let's be honest, if you're new, you're gonna be good. But I think the average system has a mix of new and old, right? And I think 20%. So let's say I have 2,000 service connections. And I have 20% that are lead, galvanized service line requiring replacement, or unknown. How many letters do I gotta send out? I have 2,000 services I gotta send out. And I got 20% that fill those 400. And I got 30 days to do it. That in and of itself, as an operator, creates stress in my life because I'm not a letter writer, right? It's got to be on our letterhead. It's definitely, I would think, going to be language that's approved by the health department. And you're going to have to make sure it gets out to them, okay? So that's a lot. And that is, in my opinion, a really well done system to only have 20%. What do you guys think? 20% would be, I'm impressed. If I was talking to somebody October 15th and they told me they only had 20%, I'm impressed. Just like I said, the red flag goes up, my red flag goes up that those people put in a lot of effort, okay? And then we get into the bigger systems, I feel bad, there's multiply what we gotta do by 100 and, yes, they have more help, but they also have more services. So they're right in the same boat we are, okay? So that's something I want to stress as kind of a capper. Do not forget about the letters. Try to get the word out to the public ahead of time so that that's not the first time they ever hear about this. Okay? All right. Taylor, do we have any questions or?
Chat. Mark up with a- And whether the question comes from the room or the chat, if you could just reiterate it or kind of open someone. So the first question, Jason Albertson, who is responsible to pay for the customer side if it needs to be replaced?
As it sits right now, well, again, we're assuming that it's what I call the traditional, the water supplier owns from the curb box or the main to the curb box. Homeowner owns from curb box to house. In that case, the homeowner is responsible financially. The supplier of water is responsible for the inventory at this point.
It also depends on what fund.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So the federal dollars, the bipartisan infrastructure, let's not get hung up on that. Any federal dollars that are used are going to say they have to be used on both the public and the private side. I would love to say, you know, I'm hoping there's going to be a way for like a village, town, city to administer funds and maybe create an RFA where contractors will install new services on the customer's own side and the municipality would administer the funds. I can't say I know that's going to happen. Okay, but it is intended, the federal dollars are intended to be used on both, not just the public side.
Lucas asks, are example letters available anywhere for us to use to send to homeowners to identify their service materials?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And my
I have
colleague,
a couple
yes,
reach out to me. I'd be more than emailing to you.
The question.
I'll
was,
fill in.
our example letters,
Yeah.
so-
Yes, okay. Are there examples to send out to customers? Yes, there is. I have them on email. Just email me. My information's on the website and I'll get back to you with it. But I got a couple from other communities right now that I can send to you.
well, I think what we should also do is make these available to Taylor and you could probably add them to your website or.
Yeah, what I can do in the following email is send both of your contact information
Okay.
or just yours. If you
Okay.
prefer, whoever's gonna be answering most of the questions.
Well, I'll send Mark and Steve's contact info.
And then the last question, if we've already submitted it, do we send out the notice to customers now or after October?
If you've
I
already
would wait
submitted
till
the
after
image,
October because you still have time to go out and figure out some unknowns because I can't believe everybody that doesn't have a unknown. So I would wait to submit that in October and give you time to find out if you have unknowns.
so what you're saying, Taylor, is they're saying the inventory is done
Done.
and they're ready to submit it?
It sounds like this person is saying that they've already submitted the inventory. so
See, that's a
no-
tricky spot because the rule clearly states that 30 days from
Days.
the date you submit your inventory, the letters have to go out. So, and I don't know how that's gonna get enforced. I was not thinking a whole bunch of systems that had to send letters would submit them before October 16th. What I mean by that is if I knew I had no lead, no unknowns, you know, so it's all copper or plastic. Once I was done, I would probably submit it, but I don't have to mail any letters, right? If I had any unknowns, any lead, any galvanized requiring replacement, I'm probably gonna wait until the last day to submit. Okay? But you should, if that was the question, you should reach out to your local health department, and ask
And get-
them if you need to get those letters out.
You said a couple times that it's ultimately the water supplier's responsibility to submit the inventory. Can you just define that better? Like if you have like a village or an authority, like supplying water to a town district,
Mhm.
who's ultimately responsible in that to submit?
Okay. So like in that, that's sometimes a little gray area. Whoever has the public water system ID number. So if you're a Mohawk Valley Water Authority, right? And you sell to whoever, okay, and don't need to get into that. And this place is just a customer of yours. They're not a water supplier. Then you're gonna have to take care of that. But this place over here has their own identity and they maintain their own pipes and they are a public water system, then they're gonna have to do the inventory. Does that make sense? So it's all gonna be defined by who you're wholesaling to or selling to, or
Would that be like inside district, outside district?
it's very similar, but not the same always, because there's a lot of outside districts that aren't public water systems. I don't want to complicate this, but there's a lot of villages who serve townships or sections of towns. The best way to do that is to legally create a district, and then that town would have their own staff to maintain the water lines and do whatever. That in New York State, believe it or not, doesn't happen all the time. What happens a lot is the town budgets X number of dollars to give to the village to maintain their lines. So there's no district. And in that case, the village is responsible for everybody they serve.
The question is, we have a few mains buried under a state road / street. Is it adequate to identify both sides of the curb stop?
What, say that again now?
Someone said, we have a few mains buried under a state road or street. Is it adequate to identify both sides of the curb stop?
Well, I think they should dig up the entire width of the state road now. Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, you're gonna do that. Now, remember this template. It's a recommended to see what's at the main, to see if there's a gooseneck, a lead gooseneck. Is it entirely possible? I'm not saying it's gonna happen, but is it entirely possible that 2, 3, 4 years down the road, that is gonna become a required item? Absolutely. And in that case, they would have to excavate. But I don't think anybody at the local health department level, if they did that, is going to give them a violation because they didn't excavate the state road.
Anything else from the room?
I guess this is just for my own personal.
Yes.
So the state and the federal government are combined with them can allow gooseneck, but they're concerned about the material past that. And that's the highest point of friction and erosion and, so they want you to identify if there was potentially galvanized with lead in front of it. Well, if it's a lead gooseneck, and they're not ultimately cared about it, then it's all for now.
Well, this is my personal opinion. Is I think these new, we talked about LCRI. There's other things that are going on federally. I think eventually the gooseneck is going to have to come out, or going to have to be identified. And if it's there, and that's what we talked about on that one slide, is find and replace, or I call it find and fix. So if you see it, it's going to have to go. I mean, most of us, and I'm not finding fault with anybody who doesn't, but most of us, if we came across a lead gooseneck now, it's going. We're not gonna leave a lead gooseneck and hook a service to it. Okay? I also believe that, I think, and again, my personal opinion, when they developed this, I think they thought of the length of the service line, all right? And that's why it doesn't change it from non-lead to a lead service line to have the gooseneck. the percentage of it that's there. Okay, so I do 100% think that in the not too distant future, that's gonna be a part of it. And if it's there, and I also think that there's gonna be some new standards to meet, and if you don't meet them, you're gonna have to start with line replacements. Okay, with your galvanized requiring replacement, your lead, and your unknowns. It's gonna trigger, hate to use that term, but I'm sure there's gonna be some compliance efforts, maybe sampling, that are gonna identify. And if you trigger those, you're going to have to begin replacement processes. But yeah. So I agree completely with your point. As an operator, why isn't the lead gooseneck in there? I do think it's,
And I'm just saying the identification process, right?
Yep. 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 yeah. And the last thing I would say on that, I was working with a community that, just like all you, doesn't have a ton of help, doesn't have the financial resources. And they took all the places, all the sections of their village that they had engineering plans for, which was a good chunk. But they had a core area of several streets in one area that had never been touched. So they went out and they did the excavation at the main, they did the excavation at the curb box, and they probably dug 35 to 40% of those. And every single one of them was lead from the main to the curb box. So I'm asking you, if you were a regulator, do you think it's fair at that point to say they made a good faith effort and just list them all as lead? I 100%, and I told them I would come fight for you every day. There comes a point where, and again, if they dug 5%, maybe I'd tell them no. But they were at 35% of their total number in that area. There comes a point where, hey, don't spend any more money, because odds are you're going to find all of them are lead in this area, right? So why are you spending your money on that? And I don't think anybody's going to find fault if they got grant money and they went to replace those and 5% of them were copper because they leaked at some point and somebody replaced them. Right? I don't think anybody's going to hold their feet to the fire over that. So, to go to your point, I mean, there comes a point where.
That's why they're allowing predictive modeling.
Yeah. And I think some of you probably have a good idea. If you have, I know where I've worked, they don't have any now, but I could have told you back in the day, every street that had lead goosenecks. And I'm sure a lot of you have that history with your system. So, yes.
University specific. The question is, based on what you're saying, if a municipality serves water to a university that owns the mains and services on their private property, it is still up to the municipality to include those services in the inventory.
It's a supplier of water. So I would encourage that person who questions, sounds like they are from a university, to work with the supplier, because it's going to help the supplier. Those people have access to all the premises. It's no different than a customer. They could go take pictures of all their incoming services to all their buildings and give it to the supplier and help them out so that they don't have to go try to do this. This is a team effort to get this done. I mean, the best operator in the world isn't going to get this done without the support of their board, okay, to some level, all right? And the best board isn't going to get this done without a good operator and some level of participation from the public, all right?
Any final questions? The town hall does shut down at 12:30, so about half an hour.
I want to thank everybody for participating. Again, I can't thank Tug Hill Commission enough for getting the word out, because, again, this isn't over October 16th. So every chance we get to talk about this, get this out to the public. Again, my big takeaway, you can't finish something that you don't start. So you got to start somewhere and get it going. Number 2, engage your board, your elected officials. staff from New York Rural Water would be willing to come talk to your board about how important it is to get the public involved and your engineers involved in this process. And I'm sure most of your local health departments would be willing to be involved in that, because again, you're not gonna get a better chance funding wise to do improvements to your distribution system. Okay, that's what we're talking about here, is distribution system improvements that always get left on the cutting room floor when people are doing upgrades because they don't score high enough. And now, now that's why we're where we're at. Okay, so thank you all, appreciate it. Yes. Not right now, but I would, again,
It's
that's
coming.
one of those that I think it's probably farther down the road than lead gooseneck. But it's coming. Oh, you bet. Thank you. Thanks.
Even after nineteen
You
eighty-six,
said you had some,
people still find lead solder because.
I get your contact information.
Lead solder, no, great.
I actually got them from,
Thank you so much.
yeah,